A hidden test. Central Park had always been a sanctuary in the middle of the sprawling metropolis, an oasis where the hum of the city felt like a distant memory, drowned out by the rustling of leaves and the songs of birds. The sunlight filtering through the trees danced on the grass, casting long shadows across the park's winding paths. It was a scene of serenity, a perfect escape from the chaos of daily life. However, that peaceful atmosphere was about to be tested in a way no one could have anticipated. On that particular afternoon, the park was quiet. The usual foot traffic had slowed, and only a few joggers, dog walkers, and tourists wandered the paths. Near the fountain, on a worn blue bench that seemed like it had been there forever, sat a man who didn't belong in the tranquil setting. His figure was slouched, his head hooded low over his face, hiding most of his features. His clothing was old and ragged, a tattered coat, frayed at the sleeves and edges, mismatched sneakers that looked as though they had been through 1,000 miles of hardware, and jeans that hung loosely from his thin frame. A brown paper bag sat at his side, crumpled and stained, its contents unseen. To anyone who passed by, this man appeared to be just another homeless individual, another person trying to survive in a city that often overlooked the marginalized. And yet there was something distinctly different about him. The subtle air of calculation that hung around him, the stillness in his posture, the way he sat, like he was waiting for something or someone. This man, however, was not what he seemed. He wasn't homeless, and his purpose in the park wasn't simply to seek refuge. This was Snoop Dogg, one of the most iconic figures in the entertainment world, known for his music, his charisma, and his ever-present confidence. But today, he had come to Central Park not as a celebrity, but as an undercover figure, testing a system that he believed had failed too many times before. Snoop had always been a person who questioned the status quo. Over the years, as his fame grew, so did his awareness of the inequalities in society. He had seen firsthand the way people of color were often treated differently, the subtle but deeply ingrained biases that shaped how individuals were perceived. He had also seen the way police officers, both in his hometown of Long Beach and around the country, often responded with suspicion or hostility to those who appeared out of place in certain neighborhoods. Snoop had witnessed the bias in action time and time again, and it had always bothered him. So he devised an experiment, a bold, unexpected move that would not only challenge the perceptions of those around him, but also expose a truth that many were reluctant to face. What would happen if a celebrity, someone of his stature, deliberately disguised himself as a homeless person and waited to see how the authorities would react? Snoop's plan was simple yet profound. He would sit in Central Park, as any homeless person might, and observe. The experiment wasn't just about him. It was about the system, the unconscious biases, and the way people with power often reacted when they thought they were dealing with someone they deemed lesser than themselves. Snoop was ready to face whatever might come, knowing that the outcome could potentially be explosive. What he didn't know was just how much this small act of defiance would ripple through the system. It didn't take long for the first signs of tension to appear. As Snoop sat on the bench, lost in thought, and the moment, a police cruiser rolled slowly into the park's lot. The tires of the car crunched on the gravel, breaking the silence. Two officers climbed out of the vehicle. They were a study in contrast. One was young, with a buzz cut and a clean, sharp uniform. The other, an older, stocky man, whose uniform seemed a little more worn and whose face bore the signs of years spent on the job. The younger officer, Officer Martinez, was the first to speak, his voice low but tinged with impatience. "Another vagrant," he muttered, glancing around the park. "This place is turning into a homeless camp. Let's go check on him." Officer Higgins, the older officer, didn't seem as eager. He adjusted his belt and shrugged. "Maybe he's harmless. It's just one person." Martinez, however, was already walking toward the bench, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the figure seated there. The two officers closed in, their eyes scanning the area, ensuring there were no other suspects in sight. Snoop, however, didn't react. He kept his head down, his hood still low, his face hidden. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he was in no rush to engage. "You can't sit here all day," Officer Martinez barked, his voice sharp, carrying a tone that suggested he wasn't used to being ignored. He stepped closer, his presence imposing as he glared down at the man on the bench. "This is a public park, not your living room." Snoop, still not looking up, took his time to respond. He didn't rush, didn't show fear. He merely reached into the paper bag beside him, pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and began unwrapping it slowly, savoring the moment as he took the first bite. The action seemed to confuse the officer. Was this man just ignorant, or was he defying authority intentionally? "Did you hear me?" Martinez demanded again, his voice rising, growing more impatient. "I said you can't just sit here all day. You got somewhere to go." At last, Snoop looked up, his eyes briefly flicking toward the officer before returning to his sandwich. His gaze was unreadable, calm, and steady, but there was an undeniable edge to it, a silent challenge. "I'm not bothering anyone," Snoop replied, his voice low and steady. "Just eating my lunch." The younger officer wasn't pleased with the response. He took a step forward, his posture stiffening as if ready to escalate the situation. "That's not the point," he shot back, his eyes narrowing. "People like you make the place look bad. You scare off families, tourists. We don't need that here." Officer Higgins, who had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, sighed. "Let's not make this a bigger deal than it is, Martinez," he said, trying to diffuse the tension. "He's not doing anything illegal." Martinez, however, was having none of it. "Maybe not," he muttered, "but we can make it uncomfortable for him." His hand subtly hovered near his baton, as if preparing for something. The moment seemed to hang in the air, thick with anticipation. Snoop, ever calm, didn't flinch. He simply continued to eat his sandwich, seemingly unaffected by the officer's growing aggression. The tension between them was palpable. Every word exchanged between Snoop and the officers felt loaded with unspoken history, with decades of societal expectations and judgments. The situation was no longer just about a man sitting in a park. It was about the assumptions that had been placed on him the moment the officers had laid eyes on him. It was about the system that had been built to classify people, to judge them based on how they looked, where they came from, and the circumstances they found themselves in. As the encounter continued, it was clear that Snoop was not just sitting there as a homeless man. He was a symbol, and Officer Martinez, in his growing frustration, seemed to sense that. Something about this interaction was more than it appeared to be, and as the encounter unfolded, it would soon become clear to all involved that this was not a simple case of a troublesome vagrant, but rather a powerful statement that would challenge everyone's assumptions. The unseen truth. Snoop sat on the bench, his back slightly arched, and his head still concealed beneath the hood of his tattered coat. The cool breeze rustled the leaves above him, and the sound of birds chirping echoed through the trees. But despite the serene beauty of the park, there was an undeniable tension in the air. The confrontation with the officers had only just begun, and Snoop's presence was beginning to draw attention from others. He was no longer just a solitary figure in the park. He had become a part of a larger narrative that was unfolding in real time. Officer Martinez's eyes narrowed as he stood in front of the bench, trying to make sense of the situation. The calmness with which Snoop responded was unsettling, even maddening. He expected defiance, a reaction that would give him the excuse to escalate the interaction. But instead, Snoop remained composed, his responses measured and his body language unthreatening. In that moment, it became clear that Snoop was playing a role, not just for the officers, but for everyone within earshot. He wasn't simply a homeless man sitting on a bench. He was a test, a challenge to the deeply ingrained biases that existed in society, particularly within law enforcement. "What's your name?" Officer Higgins asked, his voice gruff but less aggressive than his younger partner. There was a certain resignation in his tone, as though he was reluctantly aware that this wasn't an ordinary encounter. He knew the rules of engagement, had been through the motions countless times before, but something about this situation didn't sit right with him. Snoop paused for a moment before responding, his fingers curling around the sandwich wrapper. "Calvin," he said, his voice smooth and unwavering. "Calvin Broadus." The name hung in the air, and for a moment, neither officer spoke. Officer Martinez's brow furrowed as he processed the name, his mind working to piece together the fragments of information that seemed out of place. The name Calvin Broadus wasn't unfamiliar to him. It was an alias, but it was also the real name of someone who, in another context, was a well-known public figure. He had heard of Snoop Dogg. Everyone had. The rapper, the entrepreneur, the cultural icon. The man before him certainly didn't look like the superstar. He was dressed in the most basic of attire, blending in with the homeless population, as though he was trying to disappear completely. "Calvin Broadus," Officer Martinez repeated, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. He couldn't help himself. There was something absurd about the situation. How could someone like Snoop Dogg, with his fame and fortune, be pretending to be a homeless man in a public park? It didn't add up. Snoop didn't respond to the officer's tone. He simply took another bite of his sandwich, unfazed by the challenge in Martinez's voice. His silence was more defiant than any words he could have spoken. The tension between them simmered, but Snoop remained a picture of calm. Officer Higgins, sensing the situation had reached an uncomfortable stalemate, took a step forward, his voice taking on a more diplomatic tone. "Look, we're just doing our job. We've got a lot of ground to cover today, and we don't want any trouble. We're not trying to make a scene, but you can't just hang around here all day without cause. This is a public park, not a shelter." Snoop's gaze shifted ever so slightly, his eyes meeting Officer Higgins' for the first time. There was something calculating in his expression, a quiet understanding that he had already won this small battle. "I like the fresh air," Snoop said softly, his tone casual, as though the conversation was no more significant than a passing breeze. Officer Martinez, visibly frustrated, took a step closer, his voice rising once again. "You need to move along. You got anywhere else to go? The shelter's down the block. Why don't you head there instead of causing problems here?" Snoop set his sandwich down on the bench next to him, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. He wasn't angry, nor was he defensive. His demeanor was almost unnerving in its calmness. "Is that a crime?" he asked, his voice low but steady. His question hung in the air, challenging the officer's assumptions, testing the very foundation of their interaction. Martinez's hand twitched toward his baton, his fingers grazing the cold metal, though his partner quickly raised a hand to stop him. Officer Higgins had been through enough situations like this to recognize when things were about to escalate. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he knew that a small moment like this could quickly spiral out of control if they weren't careful. "We're not here to make this difficult," Officer Higgins said, his voice taking on a more even tone. "But we do need you to move. It's a public park, and there are rules to follow." Snoop glanced at the older officer, his expression softening ever so slightly. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said again, his words deliberate. "I'm just here, enjoying my lunch. If that's a crime, then maybe you need to rethink what's wrong with this place." Martinez scoffed, his patience wearing thin. "What's wrong with this place? What's wrong with you? You people are always causing trouble in the city, making it harder for the rest of us to enjoy things. People like you scare families away." Snoop's jaw tightened for a brief moment, but he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he leaned back on the bench, folding his arms across his chest. "People like me," he repeated, his voice level but laden with an unspoken weight. "I think you got it all wrong, officer. You're the ones who've got the problem, not me." Officer Martinez's face reddened at the implication, his frustration mounting. But he held his ground, unwilling to back down now. "You're not supposed to be here. Get up and go." The interaction had drawn the attention of a few passers-by, including a woman who had been walking her dog nearby. She hesitated, her eyes darting between Snoop and the officers, sensing the tension. The woman slowed her pace, watching carefully as the conversation unfolded before her. Snoop, ever aware of his surroundings, glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, sensing her hesitation. But he didn't acknowledge her presence, keeping his attention focused on the officers. The woman, unable to ignore what she was witnessing, stepped forward. "Excuse me, officers," she called, her voice hesitant but firm. "He's not bothering anyone. Why are you harassing him?" Officer Martinez whipped around, his eyes narrowing at the interruption. "Ma'am, this is none of your concern. Please move along." But the woman was undeterred. "It is my concern. He has every right to be here. You're the ones making this difficult." The exchange became a small spectacle, drawing more curious onlookers. Snoop remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the woman as she stood her ground. But he didn't intervene. He understood the larger picture. The woman wasn't just speaking for him, but for anyone who had ever been unfairly judged, unfairly treated, simply because of how they looked. The officers, realizing that they were no longer the unquestioned authority in the situation, seemed unsure of how to proceed. Officer Higgins finally raised his hand, signaling for the woman to back off. "Please, ma'am, we're just doing our job," he said, his tone softer than his partner's. The woman, not satisfied, shot a look of defiance at the officers before continuing on her way, muttering something under her breath. But Snoop, ever observant, allowed a faint, knowing smile to flicker across his lips. The woman's brief stand had been a small victory, but it was significant nonetheless. It wasn't just a random encounter in Central Park. It was a battle between the status quo and the recognition of a deeper systemic issue. And the fact that people were starting to notice, to speak up, was a sign that the world might just be ready to confront its uncomfortable truths. As the officers, now flustered, exchanged looks, Snoop took one final, deliberate look at them before standing up. The moment had arrived. The time for testing had passed, and now, the experiment was coming to a close. He gathered his paper bag and stood tall, his body language shifting from that of a disheveled man to someone with the presence of mind and purpose. He wasn't just walking away. He was making a statement. He was leaving the officers with something to think about, something they couldn't ignore. He was walking away, not as a homeless man, but as someone who had just exposed a critical flaw in the system they served. The officers, still standing there, could only watch as he disappeared into the distance, the weight of their own biases pressing down on them like an unspoken challenge. The unraveling. As Snoop walked away, his steps slow and deliberate, the tension in the air remained thick, even though the immediate confrontation had ended. His tall figure, hidden beneath the oversized coat and hood, seemed almost to dissolve into the shadows of the park's winding paths. Yet the memory of what had just occurred clung to the officers, and the more they reflected on it, the more the questions began to rise. Was this just a random encounter? Or had Snoop, under the guise of a homeless man, shown them something they hadn't seen before? Officer Martinez stood rigid, staring after Snoop with narrowed eyes. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots that seemed to defy logic. There was something in Snoop's calm demeanor, the way he had spoken, the way he carried himself, that suggested there was more to this situation than met the eye. The idea that a man of Snoop's apparent stature, someone whose name was recognized across the country, was pretending to be homeless, deliberately provoking an interaction with the police, didn't sit right with him. "I told you there was something off about him," Martins muttered under his breath, as his gaze never wavered from the direction Snoop had gone. "Did you see the way he looked at me? The way he walked away? He wasn't afraid. Not one bit." Officer Higgins, who had been quiet through much of the encounter, let out a long sigh. "Let it go, Martinez. He's gone, and no harm was done. We've dealt with enough of this in the past." Another guy trying to get attention. "It's not worth the headache." But Martinez wasn't so quick to let it go. His frustration simmered, his mind piecing together the details that, in his eyes, didn't add up. Snoop's voice had been too calm, too deliberate for a man who was supposedly living on the streets. His posture hadn't betrayed any fear, any unease. He hadn't once stammered, hadn't once looked around nervously, as someone trying to avoid the police might. "I don't know, Higgins," Martine said, his voice tight with suspicion. "Something's not right." I mean, he didn't even try to argue or resist. He just sat there, completely calm, almost like he knew exactly what was going to happen. Like he was testing us. Why would he act like that unless he was trying to make a point? Higgins was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed as he thought about his partner's words. He hadn't been as keenly aware of the peculiarities that Martinez had picked up on, but he couldn't ignore the fact that something had felt off about the whole interaction. Still, his years of experience as a police officer told him that the best way to deal with these situations was to let them slide. Let the person go, avoid making a scene, and move on to the next task. They had more pressing matters to handle after all. "We don't need to overthink this, Martinez," Higgins said finally, his tone calm but dismissive. "He's gone now. It's not like he did anything illegal. We didn't arrest him, and no one else is calling us in for any issues. Just move on." But Martinez wasn't ready to let go. The thought that someone could outsmart him, play him like a pawn in some sort of game, gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this encounter than a homeless man sitting on a bench in Central Park. As the two officers climbed back into their cruiser, the city's skyline loomed in the distance, a constant reminder of the complexity of their world. But for Martinez, the problem was not with the city or its issues. It was with himself, and the nagging feeling that, in this moment, he had been exposed. Across the park, Snoop had made his way to a quieter, more secluded part of Central Park, away from the eyes of the officers and the crowd of onlookers. The path here was lined with older trees, whose thick branches created a canopy of shadows, offering him a moment of solitude to reflect. He found another bench beneath a particularly large oak tree, its gnarled roots and twisted branches standing as silent witnesses to the centuries of history that had passed in this very spot. He sat down on the bench, the paper bag still tucked under his arm, his gaze fixed on the horizon. There was a quiet confidence in the way he moved, the way he carried himself. He wasn't just someone taking a break in the park. He was someone who understood the game being played, someone who knew how to make his presence felt without ever raising his voice. His experiment wasn't just about testing the police. It was about showing the world what happened when we let our assumptions guide our actions, when we allowed stereotypes to dictate how we treated others. Snoop had spent years in the spotlight, navigating the pressures of fame and the weight of public perception. He had witnessed firsthand how people often judged him based on the image they had of him, whether it was as a rapper, an entrepreneur, or even as a man of color in a world that often made him feel like an outsider. But this experiment wasn't just about him. It was about something larger, the systemic issues that plagued society, particularly law enforcement. It was about confronting the bias that ran deep within the system, about exposing how certain groups were disproportionately targeted based on their appearance, their race, or their perceived status. As he sat on the bench, his mind wandered back to the officers, particularly Officer Martinez. The younger man had been so quick to judge, to assume that Snoop was just another homeless person who didn't belong in the park. But what had struck him most was the officer's reaction when Snoop remained calm and unflinching. Martinez had expected defiance, perhaps a verbal outburst or resistance. Instead, he had received composure, silence, and a quiet challenge. The more Snoop thought about it, the more he realized how ingrained this bias was in the system. The way people in power responded to those who didn't fit their idea of normal, who didn't look the way they expected, was something that could be exploited. It was a flaw, an opening, and it was one that Snoop was determined to expose. This experiment wasn't just about one man's test of the police. It was about exposing the deeper societal issues that often went unnoticed until they were forced into the spotlight. It didn't take long for Snoop's solitude to be interrupted. A pair of joggers came into view, their rhythmic footsteps echoing in the quiet of the park. They slowed as they approached the bench, their eyes glancing toward Snoop. One of them, a middle-aged man with a sleek fitness tracker on his wrist, nudged his companion, a woman in her early 30s who wore a look of mild concern on her face. "Should we call someone?" the man whispered, his voice carrying just enough to reach Snoop's ears. "This guy looks sketchy." Snoop didn't react at first. He simply stared ahead, his face unreadable. He was accustomed to the looks, the judgments, the whispers. He had grown up in a world where being underestimated was the norm. But it still stung, even now, to be viewed as someone who didn't belong, someone who was out of place. The woman, her eyes narrowing slightly, glanced at Snoop with a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. "He doesn't look like he's doing anything wrong," she said quietly. "But maybe we should let the police know." At this, Snoop slowly turned his head, his eyes meeting theirs for the first time. He said nothing, but his gaze was enough to silence them. There was something about the way he held their attention, something that made them second-guess their own assumptions. The woman hesitated, and then, as though the realization had dawned on her, she nodded and kept walking, her pace quickening as she glanced back once more at Snoop. The man followed suit, exchanging a quick, apologetic look with his companion before resuming their jog. But as they passed, Snoop's lips curled into a faint smile, one that was more of an acknowledgement than a display of triumph. He had made his point, even without saying a word. People saw what they wanted to see, and they acted on those perceptions without ever questioning them. This was a world where appearances could dictate fate, where assumptions could lead to decisions that affected lives. As the joggers faded into the distance, Snoop leaned back on the bench and closed his eyes, his mind racing with the possibilities of where this experiment might take him. He wasn't done yet. The questions that had been raised, the discomfort that had been triggered, were only the beginning. The system had been exposed for what it was, but there was still much work to be done. The truth had only begun to unravel. A deeper look. Snoop sat back on the weathered bench, his mind still racing from the events that had just transpired. The joggers had gone. The police officers were likely still digesting the oddity of the situation, and the park had returned to its quiet rhythms. But for Snoop, this was far from over. He wasn't simply seeking to make a point to the officers or the people passing by. This was part of something bigger, something deeper. His experiment wasn't just a social test. It was a window into the heart of a system that often chose to look the other way, a system that needed to be examined, disrupted, and ultimately changed. As he sat there, the weight of the afternoon's events began to sink in. He wasn't just a famous rapper playing a role. He was a witness to an ongoing issue that many, particularly people of color, had faced for generations. Being seen as less than based on appearances or assumptions was a reality that never quite left him, no matter how successful he became. The more he thought about the way Officer Martinez had approached him with suspicion, the more he realized that it wasn't just about him. This was something that happened every day to countless individuals, many of whom didn't have the luxury of walking away from the confrontation. The park, now bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, suddenly felt like the perfect place for reflection. Snoop's gaze wandered toward the horizon, where the city's skyline emerged from behind the trees, standing tall and proud against the twilight sky. The contrast between the natural beauty of the park and the harsh realities of the world outside was not lost on him. Central Park was a sanctuary, but it was also a microcosm of a larger society, a society where the invisible lines between privilege and oppression often dictated who had the right to occupy public spaces like this one. He had chosen the park for a reason. It was one of the busiest places in the city, yet it had always been a place where people from all walks of life crossed paths. In many ways, it was a level playing field. Everyone had access to it, or so it seemed. The truth was that certain people were always under surveillance, always treated with suspicion. He could sense it in the way the joggers had looked at him, the way their discomfort had been so apparent when they noticed him sitting there. They hadn't bothered to ask if he was doing anything wrong. They hadn't bothered to wonder if he had a right to sit on a bench in the park. No, they had seen him for what they assumed he was, a homeless person, someone who didn't belong, someone to be ignored or avoided. Snoop had seen this before. He had witnessed it in the way people in power, whether it was the police, the media, or even ordinary citizens, quickly dismissed the concerns of the marginalized. Whether it was through ignorance or malice, the message was always the same. You don't matter. You are invisible. You are less than. It wasn't just about racial bias, although that was undoubtedly a major factor. It was about class, status, and the deeply entrenched idea that people who didn't fit the mold, whether it was because of their socioeconomic background, their appearance, or their lifestyle, were somehow other. That kind of thinking was corrosive, and it was part of the reason why so many people found themselves trapped in cycles of poverty, discrimination, and fear. And Snoop knew that the only way to challenge it was to expose it, to put it under a microscope and show the world the ugliness beneath the surface. But as much as Snoop wanted to fight back, he also understood that change couldn't happen overnight. He couldn't simply show up in Central Park, dressed like a homeless man, and expect the world to wake up and realize its flaws. No, this was just the beginning. This experiment was about planting a seed, sparking a conversation, and creating a space for reflection. The real work would come later, when the people who had witnessed the encounter began to question their own biases, when they started to see the larger picture of how these biases shaped the world around them. And that was exactly why Snoop had chosen to do this. He knew that if he had simply walked through the park as himself, Snoop Dogg, the famous rapper, people would have been more likely to defer to him, to respect him, to see him as someone of value. But by disguising himself as a homeless person, he was able to flip the script. He was able to expose the way people, especially those in positions of power, reacted to those they perceived as beneath them. He had shown how easy it was for society to overlook someone based on nothing more than a snapshot of their appearance. Snoop's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned his head to see a group of tourists, a family with young children, strolling down the path. The mother, an older woman with a camera hanging around her neck, noticed him sitting there and immediately pulled her children closer. She shot a glance at her husband, as if silently instructing him to keep their family moving. The family passed by quickly, avoiding any direct eye contact with Snoop, their discomfort palpable. It was a small moment, but one that struck Snoop deeply. He had become an object of suspicion in their eyes, a figure to be avoided, even though he had done nothing to warrant such treatment. This, he realized, was exactly what he was trying to expose. The assumptions that people made, the way they saw someone based on their clothes, their skin color, or their economic status. It all played into the larger narrative of inequality. The family's quick exit was a stark reminder of how easily people could be pushed to the margins, how a simple change in appearance could determine whether you were seen as a threat or as an invisible part of the backdrop. It wasn't enough to just tell people about the problem. Sometimes, you had to show them what it looked like, let them witness it firsthand, so they could understand the gravity of the issue. As the tourists disappeared into the distance, Snoop felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The kind of calm that comes when you know you've done something significant, when you know that you've made people think in ways they hadn't before. There was no way of knowing if anyone would change because of what they'd seen today, but Snoop knew that he had planted a seed of doubt, a seed that could grow into something much larger. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. The air was cooling, the evening approaching, but Snoop remained on the bench, lost in his thoughts. The experiment had not been about confrontation or rebellion. It was about understanding, about forcing a conversation that needed to happen. and about seeing how deep the layers of bias and prejudice ran in the minds of those who might consider themselves impartial or even just. A voice behind him broke his reverie. "Are you okay?" Snoop turned to see a man standing behind him, his face a mixture of concern and curiosity. The man, dressed in a suit, seemed out of place in the park, his briefcase held loosely in one hand. He had been walking by when he had noticed Snoop sitting alone, and for some reason, he felt compelled to check in. Snoop smiled softly, his eyes meeting the man's with a calm that seemed to disarm him. "I'm good," Snoop replied. "Just thinking about the world, you know. How people see things. How people see me." The man looked at him, his gaze softening as if he could sense the depth of Snoop's words. "I see," he said. "You're not alone in those thoughts. People see what they want to see, and sometimes they choose to look the other way. It's unfortunate." Snoop nodded. "Yeah, it's easy to look the other way, isn't it? It's easier than confronting the truth." The man paused, considering Snoop's words. He gave a slight nod before turning to leave, but not without offering a final thought. "Well, whatever your point is, I hope people start listening." Snoop watched him walk away, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he had just made another person pause, even for a brief moment, to think about the world through a different lens. It wasn't much, but it was something. The ripple effects had begun.